the future of encryption. Today, we have with us a distinguished set of panelists. We are joined by, firstly, Mr. Tom Bowman, who serves as Policy Counsel with the Security and Surveillance Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology, where he focuses on encryption, commercial spyware, reproductive and gender affirming care, and law enforcement use of surveillance technologies. He represents CDT in numerous coalitions, including the steering committee of the Global Encryption Coalition, which exists to promote and defend encryption wherever it is under threat. Secondly, we have with us Ms. Hera Hussain, who is founder and CEO at Chayn, a global nonprofit that creates resources on the web to address gender-based violence. Chayn's multilingual resources designed with for survivors have reached more than 400,000 people. Raised in Pakistan and living in the UK, Hera knew from early on that she wanted to tackle violence against women. She believes in using the power of open source technology, trauma informed design, and hope filled framing to solve the world's pressing issues. Hera was on the Forbes 30 Under 30 and MIT Technology Review's Innovators Under 35 list. She was awarded the British Empire Medal from Her Majesty in 2020. Thirdly, we have with us Ms. Ellie McDonald, who is the Policy and Advocacy Lead at Global Partners Digital, where she leads the delivery of policy and advocacy activities that seek to ensure a more rights respecting digital policy landscape. She has a particular focus on internet governance, trust and security, and emerging technologies, and represents uh, the organization on the steering committee of the Global Encryption Coalition. Previously, she has worked at the Rights Trust and Article 19. Finally, we have with us Mr. Udbhav Tiwari, who is the VP for Strategy and Global Affairs at Signal. Udbhav's experience in the technology sector spans both global and regional contexts, where he was formerly the Director for Global Product Policy at Mozilla, with prior roles at Google and the Center for Internet Society in India. He has testified before the US Senate Committee on the Commerce, Science, and Transportation and been quoted as an expert by CNN, The Guardian, Wired, Financial Times, BBC, and Reuters. Udbhav was previously affiliated with the Carnegie Endowment for Peace and was named to India Today's India Tomorrow list in 2020. And finally, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's session, Ms. Mishi Chaudhary, founder of SFLC.in and Senior Vice President and General Counsel at Word2. Having founded SFLC.in in 2010, she is a technology lawyer and an online civil liberties activist who practices law in New York and New Delhi. She has been at the forefront of advocating for internet freedom, privacy, innovation, and free and open source software. Under her leadership, SFLC.in became the premier nonprofit organization representing the rights of internet users and free software developers in India. Over to you, Mishi.
Thank you, Pranay. And I know that this is in the run up to the Global Encryption Day, which we will all celebrate later in the week. But it is also, in India at least, a big time for festivals. And that's why we are closed next week. But it is the Festival of Lights. And I think it is a good time to talk about the fun parts here. And I'm very grateful for all of you who have such great experiences, practical experience, as well as policy and otherwise, all around the world to join for this conversation. I personally feel, and I wish actually, that we should stop having these conversations. I hope we could have moved much forward. I wish that we had already realized and these debates were over. But power never rests, and power wants complete control. So here we are again. From everyone who's joining, a very good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This panel, as you already heard about their background, there is a reason all of them have joined us here. At least in India today, when something fun called Zoho and Aratai are being pushed down on Indians as the default communication. In the US, where Department of Defense or War or whatever it is right now is relying on fun technologies, which is meant for public to continue having their conversations while they would expect us to have just plain text, open conversations with everybody, so that the tools of totalitarianism, which have bound the society already, can be used against us. Um, we also see, in the face of today's advanced cyber threats, organizations, they are operating with the mindset that network perimeter has already been compromised. Everything around has already been compromised. And to succeed in this new reality, the security leaders, the CISOs of the world, they are prioritizing granular controls and architectures centered on the data itself. So you protect it at the data level rather than perimeter based defenses alone. In my day job, Virtru builds such data granular based technologies that's where we work on. Today, we are here to talk about rights, risks, and future of encryption. As I said, that um, right from the crypto wars, Philip Zimmerman, the 1990s, the export control, etc., we've been having different forms of this discussion and debate, and we still see a lot of same issues which are regurgitated, but some new ones also. And I want to offer a little bit here with this panel and to have the benefit of the presence of all these people who spend their time thinking about whether we believe the future of encryption is one of entrenchment or erosion of civil liberties. Where do we see this? From my point of view, as we've been working for now quite some time on this issue, it's not merely a technical tool, but we see it as a civilizational bulwark, a threshold through which privacy, free speech, and democratic spaces either they survive or they erode. Um, it is a rights enabler. Just encryption per se is not a luxury. In a world of pervasive data collection and algorithmic inferences, strong encryption is one of the few tools left that can reliably constrain power, whether it is state power or corporate power. Any insistence on backdoors, traceability, originators, or escrow is not a tweak, it's a trade or a complete give up. Once the integrity of an encrypted channel is concessioned, the boundary between what lawful access is and pervasive surveillance becomes dangerously porous. That's why the politics of defaults matter. Whether it is opt-in, whether it is opt-out, and what you're getting as defaults, that politics really, really matters here. The stronger and more ubiquitous encryption becomes, the more it arms the marginalized, the dissenting, and the vulnerable. Conversely, if encryption remains a niche or elective feature, it will always be the preserve of those with resources, leaving billions of us exposed. And today, it doesn't seem that there is any jurisdiction where we can arguably say that the rights are not under risks. That's why it's my great pleasure to have this discussion about rights, risk, and future of encryption. Pranay already introduced you to the panelists. I am going to ask the panelists for a brief 2 to 3 minutes opening statements so that they can set the tone of where their remarks are. I don't even know if 6 months old, what generation are they called, but we have a great um, uh, generation, I don't know what we are using, Omega, if I'm sure it's not Alpha, to join the panel here as well. But I think that's the future we are building towards and our present as well. So I'm going to start with Hera and with your opening statements. I will say that I am a little bit of a stickler on time, mostly so that you can all speak and have a discussion amongst yourselves as well. So at 2 minutes, I'll give you a warning. If you want to go up to 3 minutes, that's totally fine. But after 3 minutes, we'll just move on. Not just, and my apologies if it comes across as cutting you off there, but I'm just trying to ensure that we can continue to move. But Hera, why don't we start with your opening statement, please?
Sure. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I'm Hera, as you've heard, and this is Khashayar. He's 6 months old, so there might be a little noises coming from him. Um, really happy to be here. I founded Chayn in 2013, and since then, I have been sort of talking about how encryption is a feminist issue. It's one that I'm really happy that we're able to do more work around, especially because in the gender-based violence space across the world, we see a real cultural disconnect. There's a lot of concerns that organizations working on gender-based violence have around encryption, both in terms of child protection, about catching criminal gangs around trafficking. So there's a lot of real issues that are being sort of brought into a debate where organizations that traditionally work on digital rights will understand the nuances of those issues, but those nuances are not really coming across in the gender-based violence space. So that's the kind of work that Chan's been doing, and especially ramping up this year, because we see, like Mishi said, a real attack on privacy coming from all sorts of places. So I will just say that there are 3-4 things that come up often in these discussions. One is this idea, I think, that there's a lot of disillusionment with technology as a sector. So often the narrative that is being going around, which I really think we should counter, is that encryption was invented by tech bros in Silicon Valley to make money. And it couldn't be further from the truth. So I think there's some misinformation that has to be corrected. So this idea that anything that tech bros support is just bad, full stop, this kind of is more complex than that, and actually encryption has a long history. Second thing, that that there's nothing to, if someone has something to hide, then if there's nothing to hide, then why are people why isn't this available to law enforcement? So this backdoor argument around child safety and human trafficking comes up a lot. And the last thing that we hear quite a bit is that this idea that the scale is so big around AI generated violence, tech generated violence, that there is no other way, using traditional policing and law enforcement methodologies, that you know especially criminal networks can be caught without using decrypted platforms and using law enforcement having that access. So these are the 3 main arguments that we are coming across that Chen's working on, and I hope I get a chance to talk about some of our counter arguments to this in the panel. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I'm gonna move now to Tom. Tom, if we could have your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mishi. Thank you, Pranay, and thanks to the whole team at the Software Freedom Law Center. As Pranay introduced, I'm Tom Bowman. I work at the Center for Democracy and Technology, which is based in Washington, D.C. For the past 30 years or so, we've been working to promote civil rights and civil liberties in the digital era. We do a lot of work in the United States, but especially when it comes to encryption, we track hotspots all across the world and try to get involved where we can. And I think Mishi did a really great job setting the table. Encryption is the foundational building block of safety, trust, and security for everyone online. On a surface level, it's what protects your bank account from fraud, it's what keeps your health records private, and it's what makes sure your communications with your family stay within your family. But really, this means that it's the underpinning of democracy, and it's the essential armor of the digital 21st century. I think that there are 3 things that I hope people can take away, at least from some of the information that I share in this panel today. For one, for years, the people who are in power, and I'm thinking of high-level law enforcement and other state leaders, have wrongly framed encryption as a choice between security and privacy. And this is really a false choice. Because the truth is that this is about a choice between a secure digital world and an insecure digital world. And so proposals for undermining encryption, especially ones that mandate backdoors or client-side scanning or other forms of exceptional access for law enforcement, are not a scalpel that carefully cuts away at some privacy measures. These are a sledgehammer that break your security online. And so we have to combat that narrative that this is a choice between security and privacy. It's just not. The second is that we have to be clear about the technical reality, which is that you cannot build a secure backdoor that only the good guys can use. A vulnerability created for law enforcement is a vulnerability that can and will be exploited by criminals, hostile foreign governments, and others seeking to do harm. It's a universal key that will eventually fall into the wrong hands. And then the third is that when democratic states or nominally democratic states champion laws that weaken encryption, they not only undermine the rights of their own citizens, but they set very, very, very dangerous global precedents. They hand basically a ready-made excuse to authoritarian regimes around the world to demand the same access. And the result is that this is going to endanger journalists, this is going to endanger human rights defenders, and especially dissidents, and then members of marginalized and vulnerable communities. So we have to push back, and we cannot just allow responsible or democratic states to pave the way for autocrats. I think it's important to keep in mind that it's necessary to address serious crime and other online safety concerns, but the path forward is not to undermine encryption and create systemic weaknesses that are going to put billions of people at risk. I don't have all of the answers of how we solve this. I do think that we have to think more about resourcing targeted traditional investigations. And I think Hera kind of mentioned this as well. Like, we have successfully taken on criminal organizations through examples like EncroChat, Sky ECC, which we're happy to talk about more later on, that show that we can pursue criminals without breaking encryption and the digital security that protects us all. And at the end of the day, I think it's important to just remember that encryption is the single most important tool that we have for ensuring a safe, secure, and free digital future. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to where the conversation goes.
Thank you. Ellie, if we may have your opening statement, please.
Thank you so much, Mishi, and everyone at the Software Law Freedom Centre for organising this panel in the lead up to Global Encryption Day. It's a real pleasure to be here. As you said, I work at Global Partners Digital, a human rights organisation focused on digital tech governance. And we're also a founding member of the Global Encryption Coalition that you mentioned earlier. Like everybody that's here, we're really committed to this work because of the critical enabler that encryption is of human rights, and also its role as a cornerstone of digital security, as you've already heard. Maybe I don't think I can add a lot to what the other panelists have said, but I'd like to, you mentioned already that the scale and intensity of the threats we're seeing to encryption. I would add that what we're seeing are both blunt and fairly subtle attempts to undermine encryption. And I use the word subtle because we're seeing more sophisticated attempts to undermine encryption through different terms and phrasings, which also seek to evade public scrutiny. And I wanted to flag that second part in particular because with a lot of these proposals, they come alongside processes that lack democratic accountability and proper scrutiny. And while some of them may be well-intended, a few messages that I would just highlight here in opening are, as you've already heard, the systemic threat that they pose to security for everyone, the manner in which undermining encryption entrenches harm. So while safety is often used as a justification for these measures and for oppressive surveillance powers more generally, that frame lacks and fails to attend to the shield that encryption provides for us all and including for specific communities. Also the disproportionate nature of it as a tool, which is widely recognized by experts, including the UN Human Rights Commissioner, the European Court of Human Rights, the list goes on. And also just that they respond to quite a flawed assessment of the problems that are at stake. But I think we'll be able to unpack all of that a bit more shortly. So back to you.
Thank you. I have to say you're also respectful of time. I'm not able to actually throw my gavel and say, stop it there. But thank you. Udbhav, if we may have your open statement, please.
Thank you, Mishi. I'll try to be short and also stick to time. But I think that at least in terms of a lot of the issues around why encryption is important and what are the kinds of threats we are seeing, folks have covered most of those points. So I thought maybe I could focus on two points around one, what we are observing as Signal, the messaging application, just with regard to the broader adoption of encryption around the world. And the second is also get a little bit into the details of what are the kinds of threats that we are seeing that we consider to be the most risky or the most insidious. So, and all of them are threats that I think have been spoken about so far. So nothing particularly new there. On the things that we are seeing around encryption it's honestly been a really great year for Signal as an application in terms of the number of people who use it, the number of people who are aware of its benefits and the importance of encryption and the Signal protocol. I think because of everything that's happening geopolitically around the world is definitely only increasing every single month as compared to the previous month in this year. And for us, that's a pretty positive sign because I think it's showing a recognition of a benefit that I think the technical community has known for some time and then has implemented in global systems. But there's a much more visceral, real learning of the consequences of privacy that I think are letting people adopt and bring encryption in bigger and deeper ways in their own lives. And we uniformly look at that as a nice thing, possibly inspired by that, but maybe even because of that, we've unfortunately also seen a very worrying return of very old school legislation that very similar to the points that you made earlier. Why are we still having conversations about key escrow? Why are we still having conversations about what like ideas that in the late 1990s were dismissed as bad and cynical are all ideas that we've actually seen in practice be proposed by France, by Sweden, and many other countries around the world that have also been through these processes and don't usually fall into that category of, authoritarian regimes that are attempting to limit encryption because of bad legislation. So it's actually becoming fashionable to go after encryption again. And we think the way that intersects with AI, specifically both client-side scanning and the idea that you can scan for content before encrypting it, and therefore you're not breaking encryption, but also the general deployment of agentic systems, for us personally, are the two most real risks and threats because they're entirely outside our control, because they will happen on the operating system on which we run, which will end up meaning that the promises that people make will no longer be promises that we can keep, but we would have to be dependent on the operating systems to keep them. And we treat that as a very significant red line.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to ask you a few questions here based on what we are seeing. Udbhav, let me start with you. I think our audience, of course, ranges from people who understand very deeply about why this is important to also sometimes wondering about basic stuff. Someone once said to me, an expert is a person who has a firm grasp on the obvious. I'm going to ask you a very obvious question. What is the difference between WhatsApp and Signal? It's the same protocol. You guys talk a lot about metadata, this, that, etc. Help us understand. We are in India right now, as the hosts are in India. There are 500 million plus users in the market of WhatsApp. Signal has an increased user base here, but also has emerged as the preferred mode of communication, whether it is Peter Hegseth or JD Vance or anyone else. But everyone else is discouraged from using it. Help us understand what is the difference between these two apps.
Thanks, Mishi. Super quickly, Signal as an application is special because it doesn't collect a lot of information about a messaging interaction that almost all other platforms in the ecosystem do. And what that means is and this is especially for folks who aren't necessarily from a technical background, but many messengers today deploy end-to-end encryption for content, which means that if I were to send a message to Mishi of a cake, then the fact that that image was sent will be known to the platform. The fact that I sent it to Mishi will be known to the platform. When I sent it will be known to the platform. Both our profile images will be known to the platform. And all of this information is not usually encrypted when people say end-to-end encrypted in most platforms. Just the content itself is encrypted, which means WhatsApp will not be able to know which image I sent to Mishi, but it will know the fact that I spoke to Mishi, when I spoke to Mishi, are we in common groups together, and a lot of other associated information around it, which honestly is very risky. We've had the former head of the National Security Agency of the United States, this is a couple of years ago, testify under oath before Congress that they kill people on the basis of metadata. And the reality is that even if we look at what's happening in Gaza and many other places around the world, it is now large-scale AI systems that troll through metadata and use patterns to identify the fact that you are at risk, and then carry out actions on you because of that taking place. And what's special about Signal is that we've actually designed the whole system to make all of this information, not just the content itself, but even all of this metadata invisible to the service. So if you actually go to signal.org/bigbrother, you will see requests that we've gotten from courts and agencies that we have answered. And in the answers, you will see that we can tell the service, does this phone number have a Signal account? When was it created, and when did it last connect to the service? We literally cannot see anything else. We can't see your contacts list. We can't see which groups you're a part of. We can't see who are the members of groups. We can't see your profile name. We can't see your profile information. So our threat model and privacy posture is essentially that we protect things by either not collecting them in the first place, or even if we do collect them, end-to-end encrypting them in a manner where we also cannot see it. Which is why you don't actually have to take our word for it. You can actually verify the fact that all of this is true, both using signal.org/bigbrother or GitHub. And that's why we enjoyed the reputation that we do among the community, because we've actually had to innovate in some pretty interesting technical ways to be able to perform functionality without being able to see underlying metadata. Like if you told a postman, can you deliver a letter without an address written on the envelope, he's probably going to laugh at you. But that's kind of what Signal does, which is that we don't collect that metadata, and we operate our postal service in a manner where the people who operate the postal service can't see where those messages actually have to go, if that analogy helps.
Great. You're not governed by the USPS Privacy Act of 1974, but you're coming up with the increasingly excellent ways of making sure that many of us can avail the benefits in a much more democratic way, and it's not limited to only a few. Hera, I'm going to come back to you and talk a little bit more about how you see in your work this and pull on the thread about this is a feminist issue, and how does it help address the various ways we see the online gender-based violence. Mostly the narrative, for obvious reasons, is always about black and white options, and made us to choose as if it was only one way or the other. But this part hasn't been highlighted, how the vulnerable, how the other folks make use of these issues. If you could speak a little about that, that would be very helpful.
Thank you for asking me that question. So, like I said in my opening, that we see, especially at this moment in time, that it is a very emotionally charged issue, and child protection being one of the major theme that comes up, and also about protecting women and gender minorities, but mostly the conversation around women from increasing violence and threats. And so yeah, so that and the way that we talk about it is like you said, first we talk about the principles of the reason why we say it's is a feminist issue is because privacy is really intrinsic to doing any work with survivors of gender-based violence. So when privacy is such an intrinsic way of how confidentiality, when we talk to survivors, where we store their data, who we share their story with, as a sector, when we put all these principles in the way we work, why would we not apply these same principles into in the way we communicate with them. I think that part is easy for people to understand, but the part where it's harder is around, well, there's this Telegram group, which we know, there are many of them where, people are requesting nudes of their children and of their, like, their partners. There's, all this stuff happening. And I really like I really acknowledge that and say that that is true. That stuff is happening. And then really taking it back to three things. One is, when it comes to children become adults at a point in their lives. So encryption protects not just that protects their future selves. So, an example being all the way from like climate change or climate crisis advocacy to working on an issue like Palestine, something that was not considered a jailable offense before. We have governments like the UK now really, really making, any association with certain groups, coming under a terrorism act. So when you have, like, so if your children today will become adults tomorrow, and they might be working on these issues. It's about protecting, and again, like Mishi said, the politics of default. So it's about making sure safety is something that extended to everybody. And the second thing we talk about is that survivors are within that vulnerable group. So yes, while there are predators and like criminal networks that thrive on encrypted platforms, that's just the truth, because they use messaging apps like anybody else. The idea that, like, the vulnerability also comes from having your information. For example, if you're looking for an abortion in Latin America or in parts of Europe or in the US, and you are, trying to get in touch with abortion providers, or anyone is providing you any advice around abortion, if your government considers that's a crime, it puts everybody at risk, all the way from the sender of that message to the receiver of the message. And actually, this is why, as someone who massively like talks about the importance of promoting of dispelling any misinformation about WhatsApp, I do think this is a really good example of where Signal stands out. And this is one of the examples that we give when we talk about like encouraging people to move to Signal. I will never encourage someone to leave to go towards SMS just because Meta owns WhatsApp. So I'm still like telling people WhatsApp is good, but in ways where people can understand why it's different. Signal, that is one example on abortion care that we provide. And the third thing is around catching predators. So how can you catch predators? So here again, we talk about, well, there are lots of known like predatory individuals and networks that have existed before digital technology came into place, and yet those crimes are being they're just happening, and the law enforcement, for whatever, like, many reasons, is not going after them. A recent case of like Giselle Pellico in France, the website Cuckoo, that was up and running. It was not encrypted. It was up and running. There were like hundreds of complaints against the website. It still took French police 14 years to be able to like shut that down. So that is an example. And lastly, so like there is traditional police methodologies that can be used to go after these criminals. People who receive abusive messages can always report them. So encryption does not apply on the receiver of them. You can at any time choose to share that with law enforcement. And lastly, it is that this what was I going to say? I lost my train of thought. Sorry. There was a
We'll
third
come back
point
to.
around law enforcement, which just like escaped me. But I think like, yeah, so oh yeah, third, sorry, I got it. Which is around marketplaces. Any criminal enterprises, they thrive by marketing their product or their services. In this case, it could be violence and abuse. But for something to be marketable, it has to exist on the open market. So often, like, predatory actors will market their services on open markets. That could be Facebook groups, it could be the open web, anywhere that people can see them, and then that conversation is taken to encrypted platforms. So the point where law enforcement can go is the point where it is marketed. That is a really clear leads that exist. And lastly, we absolutely talk about, again, the importance of courts, and like the sort of the like courts again can seize anybody's device. Law enforcement still has those avenues which they should absolutely pursue. So this is not about giving predators you can do whatever. It is acknowledging that yes, some predators will not be caught because we have encrypted technology, but actually it means on the balance of things, everybody else needs this as like a firm like foundation for communication, full stop. So yeah, this is the kind of like the arguments that we present when we come across friction on this issue.
Um, it- I'd love to move on to Ellie and Tom, but Udbhav, I saw your hand raise. Was it an intervention you wanted to make at this point in time?
Yeah, no, just very quickly to, I think, just added an example to the points, all of the points that Hera had just made. The hypothetical around abortion care that she was talking about has multiple times just in the last year played out in the United States, where there have been mothers and daughters who've been sent to prison because Facebook has turned over information about them seeking care for either themselves or their friends or their children, um, with law enforcement as a part of absolutely entirely legitimate law enforcement requests. So the very real consequence of what happens if you don't have encryption and do things that are against the state, I think that and it's a sad thought, but the examples are just increasing every single year.
Okay. I think. Thank you both. For a long time, especially for those of us who come from colonial pasts, it's pretty clear what may be legal is not always just, or and it may not be actually in favor of the population it works for. Anybody could be termed a terrorist, people who were actually fighting for freedom. And the problem is we thought that we had solved a lot of issues in 20th century, and they have now, they're coming back to us exacerbated, as well as on fuel because of the advancements we have made otherwise. So obviously what might be considered correct today, a new government comes and then it turns it over to something which is illegal. We're watching the land of the brave and the free, also picking and choosing and deciding what exactly is free speech, which is mostly free speech for me, not for thee. So Ellie, because you do work thinking about these issues also in a global way. We recently, of course, recently starting in January 2025, but up to now, about UK Home Office working to issue a secret order demanding Apple providing backdoor access to encrypted files. And then, of course, we had to intervene from various organizations, including the United States government itself, to reach a different outcome. However, we do see similar legislation erupt from all around the world. Sometimes it's who's the originator of the message. But can you talk a little bit more about what the developments around the world you are seeing? And most of them, how do they actually keep engaging in this magical thinking of, oh, we are the good guys, it's going to work differently for us. Math picks and chooses whether you are doing the right thing or the wrong thing. And we see that continuously coming up. And anything else you think you are watching in terms of legislative action or just demands around the world, which we all should be thinking about in a more comprehensive way, considering what gets passed in one country obviously has an impact on the others.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Mishi. And I think your last point is so salient here. Like, to think about multilateral threats in a way is not particularly helpful because of the global effect of so many of these developments. And yeah, nonetheless, we are remaining attentive as the Global Encryption Coalition and as GPD to things that are happening at the international level and the things that we have in mind. Of course, the current EU chat control or EU proposal, which just earlier this week was intended to be debated but has been postponed, but will return to the agenda. That's front of mind. Another, of course, is the UN Cybercrime Convention. That's something that we've been keenly attentive to, and that's also very much a live threat, because while the treaty was adopted back in December, member states will be convening in Vietnam at the end of next week for the signing ceremony, where it's expected to meet the threshold of ratification and to enter into force. And I think something you said earlier related to this is very pertinent, that the kind of danger and the issue with that convention is not just kind of the specific provision that could imperil encryption, but it's the much broader surveillance logic that underpins it. But there is, of course, also a specific provision that we and others pointed out, Article 28.4 about the seizure of devices, and we and others pointed out the risk that this could compel and be interpreted by states to allow them to compel third parties to disclose software vulnerabilities or to give access to encrypted communication. So it's those kind of more nebulous or more difficult to interpret threats that are nonetheless very concerning. And then, of course, you mentioned the UK, which I know everyone here is very well versed to discuss too. But just to pick up on a point you made, Mishi, which I think is a really salient one, as well as the order, decryption order to Apple, that again, like, abides by this very secretive logic. So it's very difficult for us to even say concretely the current status of that, although there has been some reporting. We also have the UK Online Safety Act, which is problematic, and you made a point about needing to legislate in a way that anticipates more repressive trends and policies in the future. And so the Online Safety Act's now in force. It gives our regulator the power to mandate client-side scanning as and when it determines that there are technically feasible technologies to do so. And at present, they're interpreting that very cautiously, but that could always change. So I think that's a really key point. So those are a few of the things that we've had in mind lately.
Thank you. Tom, I'm going to come to you. I want to ask you a little bit about this very different world we live in. And as the rest of the world watches, some people will have to say, of course, this was always true. Now, a lot of things are apparent about Western democracies, which were earlier hidden. But we're also seeing a complete shift of how constitution, rights, etc., are being interpreted in the US. Early on, recognizing what had happened with the State Department in terms of Salt Typhoon, as well as the preference for Signal as the default communication for those at the top, it prompted CDT to actually really support an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act and say, well, why don't we all actually decide that even for the government, for everybody else, that they are already using these various things which are available. Now it should all be mandated. Talk a little bit more about that and how that was received. And when it comes to perhaps the security of the government communication or those in power, not only us as civil society go in their favor to say, go and get the best thing because you are protecting us and you are going to be dealing in information which is important as you protect us from outside actors. But that completely shifts when it talks about the citizens, their right to have similar kind of security as well as protection. But I'm just interested in talking about how that one side of the debate is received but it's completely inversed on the other side, because somehow citizens are supposed to be more naked than the state, and that seems justifiable. If you could talk about that tension a little, that would be very useful.
Yeah, and I would actually, Mishi, I would like to kind of quote yourself back to you here. I think earlier you said something like free speech for me, not for thee. And I think that's exactly kind of the message that is being promulgated here in the United States by those in power. It's security for me, not for thee, right? There's clear recognition based on practice that using encryption for your communications is the most secure form of communication. That's why we see top executive officials coming directly from the White House using apps like Signal. But then there's been mixed messaging telling the public about what they should or should not be doing. And in fact, back in November or October and November last year, there was a series of several months where several different agencies within the presidential administration came out and said you should use encryption or you should adopt this to secure your communications. And then they slowly walked it back after forces like the FBI got involved and said, well, actually, we don't really want people to use encryption because it makes it much harder for us to access communications. And so you definitely have this double speak. And again, this kind of clear message of do as I say, not as I do, because the top officials clearly recognize that encryption is necessary for securing communications. And this goes back to the earlier point I made about wanting to reframe this debate about security versus privacy and security versus security. This is not about we have to give in a little bit of our privacy to make sure our national security is better. Our national security is going to be better when we as individuals are more secure. And I think attacks like Salt Typhoon demonstrate this. Attack on critical U.S. infrastructure that wasn't secured using encryption. It demonstrates the ways in which we are vulnerable when we don't use the security tools that are available to us. And I think then this trickles down all the way into U.S. domestic policy and U.S. foreign policy. One of the biggest trends that we see right now in the U.S. domestic policy are laws that, and again, this is as Ellie kind of mentioned, kind of subtly undermine encryption without directly saying that we want total access to your communications. An example is like the Take It Down Act, which passed back in March of this past year, and the Stop CSAM, or Stop Child Sex Abuse Material Act, which is currently being considered in Congress. And basically what these laws do is they create incentives for service providers to undermine encryption and implement things like client-side scanning. These laws don't technically say you can't use encryption, and they have measures inside of them that say, well, technically this doesn't apply to encryption. But the reality is that it's in creating really strong financial incentives for service providers to drop encryption, which means that regular everyday people aren't going to have the same access to secure communications. And so we really have to push back on that. And Mishi, if I can, one other thing I'd maybe like to jump in on just in terms of other trends that I see taking place in the United States and abroad is the way that dangerous legal frameworks get copycat legislation in other jurisdictions, particularly among allied governments, and in ways that you wouldn't have maybe thought could have been done 5 or 10 years ago. But as the whole world kind of shifts towards a liberalism, you're seeing more of this propagation. And I think one excellent example of this, and I don't mean to speak over Ellie here, is like the UK's Investigatory Powers Act, which was passed in 2016 originally, and basically established a model for compelling technology companies to undermine their own security systems through technical capability notices. This framework was then lifted from the UK to Australia in the Telecommunications and Other Legislation Amendment of 2018, which contained a similar power to issue a technical assistance notice that allowed Australia to say, hey, you service provider, you have to implement this scheme to allow us to access a certain type of data. And Australia tries to do some policy kind of laundering by saying, well, it can't be used to create a systemic vulnerability. But then what happens is that kind of idea gets copied now by Canada, who's considering Canada's C2 Digital Strong Borders Bill, which includes provisions that similarly give Canadian authorities the ability to issue technical assistance notices that also could be used to undermine services providers' ability to provide secure communications. And basically what's happened is step by step, this legislation is being copied from one jurisdiction to the next. So while it might be easy for a state to say, oh, well, that only affects users in the UK, or that only affects users in Australia, slowly this is making its way to other places, and it's getting more and more bold. And I think the UK again is a great example of this. The technical capability notice that they have under the Investigatory Powers Act claims the authority to apply their laws extraterritorially, which means that we can apply it to people all throughout the world. So when we order Apple to undermine their encrypted cloud storage service, they say it applies beyond just the UK. Now, again, that was challenged by Apple, and recent reporting says that maybe the order has been trimmed back. But the point is that the UK claims the authority to make this apply extraterritorially. So unfortunately, as I think has often been the case, the West is not the example that we want to follow either on how we approach these things, because they're using legislation to slowly, subtly, but significantly undermine encryption.
Great. Thank you for such an upbeat note on the fact that we are all doomed because everyone has lost the moral high ground to do the right thing, or everybody's perhaps masks are off. We were always like this, but jokes apart, this is a really serious business. I'm going to do one thing. This is a very serious topic, but I still want to do a little bit of a quick in my greed to learn more and more from this panel, I'm going to ask you quick questions, very fast, and I would like short answers from each of you. Just take a question and answer, mostly so that we can cover a little bit more ground of where we are. All of you have made some excellent points. I want to understand a few more things, and if I may ask, just be very, very brief in your answers so that we can go quick in a rapid fire way. We talked a lot about in terms of how whether it is FBI steps in or other agencies who are doing investigation on crime, and there are a few things which are always cited: national security, protecting children, crimes are being committed, etc. I want to understand one thing, because the interest of such those in power is to keep the debate very, very black and white and not nuanced enough. But give me just very briefly, what are the alternative data access strategies law enforcement can use to get the access to what they want, while we keep using Udbhav didn't pay me at all. It's just as a great user. I love the technology, and I think that, but so that everybody can use end-to-end encryption without having their metadata and all that information being collected to that extent. What are the alternative data access strategies law enforcement has available to them, but either chooses not to use it, or pretends in public that, oh, those are not going to work? Anybody? Tom, Ellie, Udbhav?
Happy to very quickly go. I would say my top two are: number one, I don't think that there's a problem of lack of data to perform investigations. If anything, I think there's ample evidence that law enforcement has far more data than they know what to do with. And the barriers that encryption creates are very rarely barriers that would mean a crime cannot be investigated at all. And the second, I think, is also just simple real world investigations, right? I think that what's happened with the internet and the growth of technology is that we suddenly have the ability to be able to subpoena everything and ask everything about everything in order to build a profile and perform investigations. And I think that it makes the privacy versus law enforcement debate a lot more stark in comparison. And so, yeah, real world investigation methods, and also using the data that they already have, because more often than not, they already have what they need.
Anyone else wants to weigh in? Tom?
Yeah, I think one other option, and I totally agree with Udbhav, that there is enough data already, and I think this is the same thing, changing subject slightly when we get to AI, like scanning the entire internet for information is not going to be helpful to most law enforcement officers. So we have to invest in the traditional investigative techniques. I think the other thing is increasing reporting mechanisms. And I think Hera kind of mentioned this as well. Like encryption doesn't prevent an individual involved in the communication from reporting the communication to law enforcement. And so I think really focusing on how can we empower victims, marginalized and vulnerable people to assist in investigations is a really important step that we can take.
Okay, great. Hera, because you work in this area as well quite a lot, can you talk a little bit more about when you see this as being presented as when it is necessary for a lot of us, including the victims, to be able to communicate privately, securely with whoever they would like to communicate, whether it is the legal representative or anyone else. But there is also this push from law enforcement. Talk a little bit more about the third-party disclosures or trying to do some warrant-based device access, etc., or various other ways which are available to law enforcement.
Yeah, so, like I said before, traditional methodology, whether it is actually, getting hold of devices, doing, the lawful sting operations, and obviously the law differs on what is considered lawful in different places. So not getting into that, but just general good forensic techniques. And the reason why we know about these things like Telegram groups is because a journalist was able to get into them. How did a journalist find out about them? How did a journalist get into them? I think there are like all of these like really traditional, like, dog with a bone techniques that need to be done, more awareness on how people can report things. And then lastly, I think this is where it's more of an attitude thing, is that because law enforcement can request access, cost cutting and lots of other like issues, they feel like they should have access. But that should not be
It's
the
kind
end
of
of investigations. If you cannot get messages if you cannot access someone's WhatsApp chat, why don't you perform all the other things that you can do to find out about like an individual? So I think it's just more that it's a convenience thing as well, where there needs to be a shift in that mindset where it's not like convenience for the sake of like, and that's why they need access to this. Often they block investigations because like, well, we don't know what happened with it. There's nothing more we can do. But there are things more, it's just more costly. So it's about resourcing those kind of like investigations is really important.
Okay, great. Ellie, I want to start with you, and then I would like all panelists to weigh in. Can you point just two major things, rest of us, civil society, people who are users, etc., should pay attention to in terms of encryption? Two things you would really like them to pay attention to, and forget all technicalities or anything which can dive basically distract them. If I were to only say, I don't understand anything, but I would like to pay attention to two things anytime this discussion comes up, what are those things they should be able to pay attention to? It could be, or if you want to say that right now, you already talked about legislations that were being enacted and what we are doing, but something else which people can pay attention to, join the resistance in ensuring that we are private and secure for everybody. So I'll start with Ellie, then come to Tom, Hera, and then end with Udbhav on that.
Mine is super simple. It would be pay attention to the Global Encryption Coalition and what the members are doing there. Sorry, I might have stolen your line, Tom, but I truly think it's been such a fantastic resource, and it's through that we've pooled so much knowledge about threats and kind of amplified resistance to them. And I think it's been really effective. And we didn't get onto strategies, but I think that coalition has a lot of effective strategies in our toolbox.
Oh, talk more about strategies a little. Please do.
So I think I was thinking about what kind of united some of the effective resistance we've seen, and a few things came to mind. So one was that in cases like EU chat control, what we've seen kind of turn the tide of certain government opinions, or to a lesser extent the Cybercrime Convention, is kind of leveraging or manipulating the fact that governments aren't monolithic, and so even if this is being pursued by a Home Affairs or a Justice Department, like getting the Cyber Department on side or the Foreign Affairs Department can be a really effective strategy. And also like how valuable external voices have been in the debate. I mean, while despite the kind of swathe of problematic policy and context in the US, like the intervention of the US in the Investigatory Powers Act notice to Apple has been quite effective. And the voices of tech companies, and particularly, the signals of the world has been really useful. So those are some good, useful strategies we've seen.
Great, thank you. I forgot the order, Eileen.
I'll jump in next,
go.
Mishi. Thanks. If I could say two things again, one would be, watch what governments do, not necessarily what they say. And this is what I was saying earlier. Look at how they are going to secure their communications. Look at how top officials are communicating with one another on secure platforms like Signal. And I think that is actually probably a pretty good example of what you should be doing as well. The second, which I don't think we've talked on much at all, but I do just want to raise as an issue that I'm thinking about, is be very weary of some of the service providers that are slowly implementing new, quote, tools into their services. So some service providers, and I don't want to name names, that claim to offer encryption are implementing things like AI assistance in their chat features. And be very, very careful as to how that is actually affecting your privacy. And so when I hear Udbhav talk about Signal, it always just makes my heart happy, because I'm convinced that Signal is going to be the best and most secure platform for all users to use. And so be really, really mindful as service providers roll out new features that they say preserve encryption, and maybe do a double check. Look at what the Global Encryption Coalition is saying about those features, and really think about whether or not they are still truly preserving end-to-end encryption.
Great. I mean, there's so much we haven't covered yet, so I would really like that. I am extending a time a little bit, so that, but you're absolutely right. So Hera, you're next, and then Udbhav.
Okay, two things. One is, on the issue of encryption, you might find yourself agreeing with organizations, businesses, government departments that you would normally not think that you'd be on the same side. I would pay less attention to who is arguing for it and think more about the foundations and principles that we want to build civil life around. So don't get caught up on actors as much as what the principles are and why safe and private communications is important for everybody. Number two is that there's if you're talking to someone who doesn't know anything about encryption, I would think of it as ladders. I always push people towards WhatsApp first, because I'm one thing done, great. Then help them understand things like their employer's email address, think about what the privacy policy there is, just helping people make those small switches. And then I push them towards, okay, yeah, well, you've done this. Have you thought about Signal, especially if there's people who work in human rights, and helping them? So it's I think of that as a ladder. How can I convince someone to value those small changes? I think that is a good approach that we need to, as a sector, we need to sort of adopt a bit more. And I'm very interested to see what Udbhav says.
Great. Thank you. I understand how that ramp works, and I'd rather have a ramp towards more privacy securing than less of that. But now that AI agents have entered the chat for everything, my default rule is I don't like you, AI, from any feature. I don't need you. I still want to use my own brain. Just go away. But obviously, I'm a Luddite. So, Udbhav.
Thank you. Two quick things. The first, and I mean, this is a variant, I think, of the point that Hera had already made. Please make people use encryption, find out why it's important and make people adopt it. The more people who adopt encryption, the harder it becomes to restrict it. You'd be stunned that, I think if no country in the world would have allowed end-to-end encryption to exist, if people would have asked for permission before developing it and deploying it. It just does not fit within the interests of any state to let people be able to talk to each other in that private manner. And I think it's a right that we, like at least 4 billion people in the world today, by most approximations, use every single day, but very few of us really like understand and internalize. So spreading the word about it is essential to defending it. And the second, I think, is also try to make sure that when you look at encryption and you look at like magical thinking type technical solutions, that you always understand what the purpose of encryption is. And the purpose of encryption is to maintain privacy. So if whatever solution is being proposed negates the very purpose for which encryption is being used, it is a solution that is as bad as breaking end-to-end encryption. And I think most of the current debate, apart from breaking keys today, has actually become about like, let's do this before or this after or this when. But all of them negate the purpose of encryption and are just ways in which like people are using wedge issues like um, CSAM, like terrorism and others, to help create a divide that they will then want to fill. And that is both folks in the private sector, but also intelligence agencies and law enforcement, because states don't generally like the fact that this happened.
Great. I do want to, that I've extended your time. I'll just need 5 more minutes here, but I want to hear one more thing from all of you. Every time I have thought about privacy as an environment issue, an ecosystem issue, mostly that if you break something, you're not only compromising yourself, but you're also compromising me, and I didn't sign up for that. And because if it has to work for all of us together. In India right now, at least for the last 2 weeks, this is important. And those of us, the government has now decided that the great way to resist the American tech platforms is to move from one vendor to the other vendor. Those of us who come from open source communities don't ever like vendor lock-ins for any reason. We would like more interoperability and frameworks to come from government so that implementations can be as many. But India also has a notorious reputation of trying to ban open source applications like Brar and Element and all, Matrix and other things, when the problem is of a different nature. Right now, we've moved to something called Zoho. They have an app called Arathai, and which does not have end-to-end encryption. And it's a feature which can be later on introduced. And there are increasingly interesting examples of coming of, oh, you can have a secret lover, but you cannot have something which is against the government. And I think about this is like, as we think about privacy, the first part of it is secrecy, so that our ability to keep the messages private, so that the content is known only to those who we intend to receive them. But then there's also anonymity, which we talked about earlier. And that is our ability to keep our messages, even when the content is open, obscure as to who has published them and who is receiving them. Because that's an interest which also is important for our consumption of something. And then is the autonomy, which is our ability to make our life decisions free of any force which has violated either our secrecy or our anonymity. So from all of your points of views right now, when people are being forced to say you move from one thing to the other, what do you think? It's great that we all use it. We are trying to push people, but if you think that there are other ways of tackling this problem, and for them to understand this black and white issue of, oh, if I do that, people are telling me I'm going to give up on security. What is it that you would think about we can, as organizations who work here, as journalists who work in this issue, can highlight and can push back on and rely on other kind of resources which tell them why this is important? I like to talk about sometimes, of course, the financial markets would not exist, the healthcare information which would not exist, but I want to understand more. What is it that we can point to that this is also important in our lives? It's not just about you controlling our messages. So any kind of tactics, any kind of other things you can talk about for general public or organizations as your concluding remarks, and wrap it up how you think about this, that would be great. I'm going to this time start with Tom.
Yeah, I think one of the best tactics that we can use are kind of like face-to-face conversations that seek to demystify encryption. So kind of explaining that this isn't about going dark, this isn't about keeping secrets, this is about kind of securing your rights, and your rights to associate, your rights to communicate. Um, and that really requires that we use platforms that actually promote those rights. And so I think that it's really important that to the extent that we can, we need to have direct conversations with each other about why we are doing these things and why it matters. And then bringing those conversations to legislators and other influential voices who can help kind of share that up. And I think, unfortunately, at least from the US, in Congress, there's not a lot of education about how encryption works, what exactly it is. And so the way that we can kind of build momentum is by talking to people, regular everyday people, about why this matters and having helping them kind of bring this issue to the attention of their representatives.
Great. Ellie?
Sorry, just unmuting. I mean, I think we've covered a lot of ground already, and you've alluded to the very compelling security arguments. But what I would add, I don't know if it will necessarily always convince a legislator, but I think it's super important for the public is just to tell those really positive stories about what encryption facilitates for them. And I think Chayn's work on encryption as a feminist issue is such an important example of this. But stories about how encryption is an enabler of self-actualization, for instance, for a queer youth, like those kind of stories, like to see that this is plays such a vital role in our lives, and privacy is such a net positive and good in that way too.
Great. Udbhav? Udbhav?
Thank you. Yeah, super quickly, I would say that for me, I think there's actually not as much of a realization of just how widely deployed encryption is in the world around us, like not just the financial markets and the specific use cases of places where encryption protects something important, but we're actually like more than 95% of the page loads on the internet today are encrypted by default. And that number was 14%, I would say about like maybe 10 years ago. And that increase has happened because there's a growing recognition of the protection that encryption brings. And it is now, I'm reasonably confident to say, become one of those technologies that I don't think there's any going back from encryption being present as widely present as it is today. The only way that we would go back is if we actively decide to create more risk and create more harms that we would be willing to take as a society, and therefore roll those protections back to us. I do think there's some fragmentation happening globally at that level. For example, TLS 1.3 doesn't really work in China because China has decided to block it as a part of the Great Firewall. But ultimately, it is a necessary and active part of our lives. Documenting them, telling the stories like people have mentioned, but also realizing it is almost like trying to ban or regulate mathematics. Like as long as you cannot prevent people from doing numbers on a processor, which is what encryption ultimately is, encryption will always exist. And if you ban it, then the good people will never be able to use its benefits, but all of the other people will continue doing math and therefore will be protected anyway. So I don't think a criminal is going to go, oh shit, encryption is blocked, I can't talk to my other criminals anymore, because they'll just talk to them on other applications that they already have and can create.
Great. Hera, you have the final word.
I think Hera's out. She said she needed to step away for something with the baby.
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed that out. But thank you, everybody. This I obviously took liberties to extend the conversation without seeking your permission. But it's a topic we could go much deeper here. I'm truly grateful for 4 of you adults and 1 our future generation to join this panel. This has been very, very important. I really do think that freedom as well as any kind of self-actualization or other rights cannot be really practiced unless we have privacy as well as security of our own thoughts. If we are not free to have our thoughts, discuss them with our people, anything can be taken away from us, as we are seeing even in Western democracies as things are moving. So we have a lot to work on, considering it's Sisyphean. Every time we make some progress, we keep moving backwards in discussions, but we can build better technical tools for sure. And all of us, people who work in tech, are working towards this. I will also put a plug here. I am not paid by Signal Foundation, but I am paid by Workthrough. We do offer granular security on data, and the kind of customers who come to us Virtue is also a testament of about how global markets, businesses, healthcare systems will not work without such things. So as you all move into working more and more, I'm glad that you are all at the forefront of these fights in different forms. Very, very grateful, and wish you all a very good festival season. And thank you for joining. Over to Pranay, who will conclude this. And my apologies to Pranay as well as everyone else, because I took longer than I was allocated.
No issues. Thank you, Mishi. Okay, with this, we have reached the end of our panel today. Thank you to all the attendees who have joined us. Thank you again, Ellie, Hera, Udbhav, Tom, and Mishi, who chose to take time out of their busy schedules and be a part of this panel discussion. Finally, I thank the entire SFLC.in team for their efforts in organizing this event. Goodbye, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.